Tonight on the Social Science Podcast, we are looking at the racism that shocked Britain, the cases that changed laws, the then and now of racism in the capital, and if society has really seen a shift at racism at the hands of our institutions.
The young people are still stopped and are still searched.
We will hear the voices of those who have witnessed the changing face of Britain, reporting on evolving social attitudes and, crucially, the victims of interpersonal, institutional and internalised racism then and now.
Went anywhere,
Right.
because they were called niggers and coon. Went outside looking for trouble and they took his life. My name's Jackie, mother to 3 boys, been in education for 40 years.
Okay, what can you tell me about growing up in West London?
Oh my day, it was fun. My family migrated from Jamaica in 1957. My dad came down on the Windrush. They were relatively happy. When my dad came in the 50s, it was pretty horrendous. They couldn't rent anywhere because they were called niggers and coon.
Was this openly
It was
neighbourhood?
openly, yeah. Even when I went to school, I was called, Gollywog, I remember being called.
From what age was that a standard experience for you? From 5 years old?
From 5, being called horrible names.
And you understood what
to
the meaning?
fighting. Well, you felt it wasn't right.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand, get a handle on what they were on about
Yeah.
till a bit later on.
The Brixton riots were sparked by police brutality. What can you tell me about your experiences during this time?
I was a parent, I was a young mother. I remember and finding it very difficult to get a job. One of my brothers went to over 100 interviews before he actually got a job. Black boys couldn't go out with, was it stop and search all the time? My brother's been stopped 10, 20 times. He's probably not 19 yet, but he was stopped a lot of times. You know, they weren't bad boys. Police were very nice. You know, I'm not saying I dislike the police because they've got their role to play, but what I'm saying is they seem to set upon people of colour never doing the right thing or never in the right place.
Right. Disproportionately.
And therefore it just ignited. Everybody was just at one with that because it was happening not just to one or the odd one, it was happening to all the black boys.
In the 90s, the Lawrence trial illustrated the attitudes towards young black men. Could you tell me about feelings in that time?
But what actually happened to that boy was very, very sad. He was let down because he was an architect. That was his aspiration, to become an architect. A couple of boys went out for the night. They went outside looking for trouble and they took his life. I think it's sad. They've changed history, they've changed laws, but it's taken 30 years for things to change. But the police, again, there was a lot of failings there. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. If it was somebody that was white, they would have gone to the ends of the earth to find out, but it took 20 years to find out most of it.
Yeah.
I think that's what's sad.
If we consider intersectionality, can you tell me about how being a lady has made you feel more threatened?
Well, yeah, I've been stopped. I mean, I remember getting into my cousin's car one day. Police stopped the car. And I knew I'd be safe, but that didn't matter to them because they told him to get out. They told me to get out. They were rude to me. They swore at me. And as much as you say, well, I'm going to report you, you know, it's going to take years before you get anywhere with it because nothing really, really happens when you go up against the police or they start threatening your whole family. It's just a can of worms, the police, really.
Yeah, you wouldn't ever feel comfortable to challenge, never.
I would challenge them now that I'm much older, but I'll probably die before anything come of it. Still worry about my own 3 sons, and I think it's more of a face-off now. Then, their accents were very different, not as English as we now sound.
If we look at the attainment levels in education, there is a significant difference between Caribbean boys particularly. Can you tell me as a teacher how you think this has played out?
I find black boys, at nursery they're fine, they excel. At juniors they excel. At secondary, things go very wrong. My first son, when he got to about year 9, things started to go a bit down for him in the sense that I felt, but then I'm going to be biased because he's my son and I'm going to protect him, that he was picked upon Why he was picked up on, I still don't understand. I was called in because, his behaviour is obviously deteriorating. I'm not happy, they're not happy, so I went in. So I brought my log with me. They were saying, well, his behaviour is deteriorating. We don't understand why. Is there something going on at home? Well, there's nothing going on at home because I'm at home with my family. So we had everything we need. We were fine. So I opened my log and I said, well, on the 1st of March, this was reported. On the 2nd of March, that was reported. She was quite amazed at the amount of information that I had. Yeah. At the end of the conversation, she said to me, because I had my evidence, I think we should get him some pastoral support. What does that pastoral support mean? Well, nothing ever came of it, and I still kept my notes. You have to have that relationship with your children, know what is actually going on in school, because you're not there to see what is actually happening. All you've got is what they come home and they say to you. However, he did leave school with 7 GCSEs, so I'm quite happy with that.
That concludes the interview with Jackie, and she's offered a really incredible insight into her lifetime of experiencing racial prejudice. And to break it up a bit, Jackie has experienced different types of racism from a very young age, and she described to me very deep interpersonal racism that her father experienced at the hands of the Teddy Boys. When she described this alongside her experiences in education from the age of 5, I felt that this was a really standard way to treat black people at the time. When I reflected on the interview and looked back at Jackie's accounts, I felt there was a massive institutional undertone to the social attitudes. What we can see here is the Windrush was basically a scheme that involved a huge community coming over from the Caribbean, being offered citizenship by the UK, being told that they were entitled to that and they'd be offered work and they'd be able to rent houses. And what they faced was several layers of discrimination. What's really astonishing is that only in 2020 was a review made into the Windrush scandal, and Wendy Williams has said that there was institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards race, but hasn't exclusively said that the Home Office was racist. She's offered 30 recommendations and hasn't stated that the Home Office was or is racist. If we review now what we know about the Windrush scandal, 500,000 people were offered the right to remain in the UK between 1948 and 1971, but a change in immigration law in 2012 meant that members of that community who have lived in the UK for 50 plus years were challenged, and over 80 people from that community were sent to the Caribbean when they were rightfully British citizens and could only be challenged on this because of the failure of the British government. I think this is really important to consider when we look at what race and nation really mean, and is the nation just a set of policies controlled by the state? If we consolidate what we now know about the Windrush generation, members of the British colonies were granted British citizenship by the state, and it's the state that are in control of these policies. And in 2012 they decided to make a policy review that led to the imprisonment and what they would describe deportation of what are really rightful British citizens. The only clause that would affect their citizenship was a lack of documents when they came over. They came over on their parents' passports, and that happened under the nose of the British government. They saw this and they allowed it. If we consider the concept of structural racialisation of immigration, the Windrush scandal is really the primary example. The use of policies to dictate who are British citizens and when they can be, and it appeared to be when it suited them because they were of working age. If we review Jackie's timeline of racism over the years, a great deal of it has roots in the policies of the British government. A set of policies allowed multiple generations to be imported as British citizens, work hard for the majority of their lives, while facing racist abuse at an interpersonal level and within the smaller institutions. We consider what institutional racism really is. It's not just the surface level teachers discriminating Caribbean boys or the police stop and searching young black men. It's also about the policies of the state dating back to 1948. Jackie's offered a really valuable insight to the education system, and particularly some key points that she believes factor into young Caribbean boys failing. If we look at the attainment levels, there is no doubt that Caribbean students, and boys in particular, are struggling and experiencing a massive change in secondary school, which is what Jackie spoke about when she was discussing her older son. And Jackie made a great point about parents playing a role in their child's education. She felt that she had to do this by monitoring day-to-day events and drawing a bigger picture of what was going wrong. And in education, this has been previously labelled as parentocracy. It's the involvement of parents and how it promotes their child's education, particularly in terms of socioeconomic differences. Here we can see Philip Brown has used the term parentocracy to describe the shift in the 80s towards parental involvement in education and how much this played a role. I think when we look at racism, this is really striking and quite sad, because Jackie was talking in her interview about how important it was to stay involved in her children's lives and know what was going on during their education, because she understood the value of education. And I think for her it was really different. It was about saving her children from what she described as being picked upon. And I think she recognised there her role and how it could really affect her child's success. Another thing that really struck me when we consider parentocracy in terms of racism was that Jackie was, when she was talking about being stop and search, she said with her kids now it's more of a face-off. That's the word she used. And she picked up on their accent and how they sound more English than people did before. And I think this is considerable when looking at parents in education and the role they play. Are language barriers getting in the way of children's educations? And are parents who can speak English sufficiently, are they at an advantage? It's also really interesting to look at the government's response in this case. The attainment differences in education are massively focused on socioeconomic factors. They've talked about free school meals and the indicator of that, which is very true, and it's discussed in class divisions in education. However, in terms of race, there's an anomaly, and they've recognised that. And it's the fact that Caribbean boys in particular are failing over different classes. It's not just the working class. I think it's interesting when you look a bit closer at the Strand report. They've said that white British pupils are actually not performing as well as ethnic minorities when you account for socioeconomic status. If we consider this and the fact that Caribbean boys are doing worse in secondary school regardless of their class, there is a bit of a contradiction in the Strand report, because it emphasises factors that are external to the school and individual to the child, such as their family structure. However, when it comes to Black Caribbean boys, this really isn't applicable. One thing the Strand report did do to explain the really problematic differences that Caribbean boys are facing, what they call the immigrant paradigm, which apparently explains the differences in Black Caribbean and Black African students. However, the report also states that educational practitioners should be aware of the differences and push each child to their full potential, which to me indicates that teachers could be doing more. I think this brings us on to cultural deficit ideologies, and it's what some educational theorists believe is provoking racism in education. And it's the belief that teachers might have that certain cultural groups are disadvantaged because of their values or traditions. And we know that teachers are predominantly white middle-class women, and theorists have talked about the effect this might have on Black and ethnic minorities, students' relationships with their teachers. And, you know, the Strand report said that teachers should be pushing all children to their full potential. And I think cultural deficit ideologies can look like racial stereotyping. It can be them having low expectations for Black and ethnic minority students, and it's also a lack of policies. Now, the Strand report could have been a great opportunity to take hold of this and to implement some teacher training. I think it's important to ask, are we seeing Black Caribbean boys failing because of strained relationships with teachers who are not keen to approve of students who don't possess the cultural capital of their white counterparts, and who also don't appreciate the reality of racial inequality? This brings us on to my last point on the differences in education, which is colourblind racism. And I think when we look at cultural deficit ideologies, they are really a current issue, and they could be causing teachers to cast aside children from ethnic minorities without considering the racial prejudice they are already facing in and out of the education system. This could also factor into the child's presentation, communication or behaviour. If they already feel judged and cast aside, they might not fit the ideal pupil who has the cultural capital of a middle-class white student. And I think we need to consider what education is. It's a system that wants to teach, and it wants children to respect the teachers. And we have to ask, how can a child respect their educators who lack understanding of British history, who don't teach the real British history in some cases? They lack a range of cultural practices and a willingness to accept racism that is still very much current. I think the last point I'd really like to make about Jackie's interview that struck me was when I thought about intersectionality, and I asked Jackie a question which really I wanted to see how she felt specifically as a lady being black. And I thought it was very interesting that she answered with a story about a stop and search she faced, but it was when she was with her male cousin. And I just thought it was interesting because I was really wanting to see how she felt, sort of another layer of vulnerability being a lady, but she automatically thought of a story of her being with a young black cousin who's a male. However, that also made me think of another level of intersectionality, and it was age, because she later on said nothing happens when you go up against the police. Now, she did say, I might go up against them now, and I don't know if that's with her being older and being more confident, or if it's the system being more inclusive, but I felt that the intersectionality she faced was being a young black person, and I felt that she identified young black males really struggling more. We are now going to hear from BBC News correspondent June Kelly, who is answering some of my questions on change in racism over the last 40 years.
Well, the Met Police's failings in the Stephen Lawrence case shocked the public and the white-dominated media. But if you spoke to black communities at that time, they weren't surprised. And young black men especially said the police's approach and attitudes mirrored the way they were treated by officers. For example, they said they were constantly being subject to stop and search. Well, after the 5 suspects in the murder were charged, the Crown Prosecution Service then said the case couldn't go to trial because there was insufficient evidence against them. In a highly unusual move, Stephen's family and their lawyers brought a private prosecution against the 5 men. Now, 3 stood trial, but they were acquitted by the judge because he ruled that the key witness, and this is Stephen's friend Dwayne Brooks, the judge said that Dwayne was unreliable in his identification evidence. Of course, Dwayne was a young man who was still in a highly emotional state and was suffering from PTSD. Well, the Macpherson report, which followed the Stephen Lawrence murder, the whole issue of this private prosecution was looked at, and the feeling was that the judge had made the right decision and the case simply couldn't go on. Watching him in the witness box, it was very painful because he was clearly struggling. He clearly wanted justice for Steve, but it is a very, very tough arena when you are standing in the witness box at the Old Bailey. Well, Mark Duggan was a 29-year-old man of mixed heritage, and he was shot by the police, who said he was armed and posing a threat to them. Now, Duggan was a gangster, but for the black community in Tottenham, his death reinforced their negative view of the police. And, for example, we spoke to one young black man who'd watched the police operation from a tower block nearby, and he was adamant that Mark Duggan had thrown a mobile phone rather than a gun over a fence when he was stopped by the police. He was absolutely certain about that when the view was that a gun had been thrown. Now, black community leaders in Tottenham, they, as young men, had lived through the Tottenham riot of 1985 on the Broadwater Farm Estate. So we're talking here, this is a generation ago. But they were still unsurprised that the killing of Duggan led to violence. Well, we spoke to black men who'd been involved in the Toxteth riots of 1981. But they didn't call them riots. They described them as an uprising, which of course is very interesting. And they said they were disappointed and frustrated that 40 years on, black people weren't represented in all sections of society. Now, we also spoke to people in Toxteth who were in their 20s and 30s, and they felt they were still battling and being judged on their colour. And also, interestingly, they believed their heritage was still not being acknowledged in lessons about British history, and that everything was still seen through a white lens.
That concludes the interview of June, and we're now just going to go over the points we've covered. And I think much of the racism we've discussed then and now is linked to institutional wrongdoing. I think the first and the greatest case of misjustice is the Windrush scandal that saw 500,000 people move to the UK and become theoretically at one with our nation. Unfortunately, we are forced to question the truth in this, as the reality of the scheme revealed questionable intentions from our state, who benefited from the influx of working-age members of the colonies who were now granted British citizenship. However, when such hard-working individuals and their families were older in 2012, new policies forced the imprisonment and so-called deportation of members of this community, revealing the togetherness of our nation to be as minimal as a document, because that is the grounds they were excluded on. Other massive issues institutionally are the education system and the police. Now, we are seeing research done on attainment gaps in education, but I still feel more could be done to address Caribbean boys being picked upon and having different experiences of education to their white counterparts. In terms of the police, I feel the Baroness Casey report offered a great summary. Black men are still being disproportionately stopped and searched, even since the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement. This report came out in 2023, and this just appears to be embedded in the Met. I think the only progress we have seen is a shift from open interpersonal racist attacks to institutions doing the jobs for these racist individuals. And I believe I've found the institution of the government to be at fault for a lot of this, in how they treated the people who came over on the Windrush and how that established the treatment of black people.